The year is 1928. In a booming and prosperous America, Herbert Hoover runs for the presidency with a campaign that promises a chicken in every pot and 2 cars in every garage. He says,
"The poorhouse is vanishing from among us. We shall soon be in sight of the day when poverty will be banished from this nation."
Yet only 8 months after Hoover takes office, the stock market crashes, and America is plunged into the most paralyzing depression in its history. In 1932, the man who will succeed Herbert Hoover as president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, pledges a change.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
Franklin D. Roosevelt will be elected to an unprecedented 4 terms. What is this new deal he has promised the American people? Why is it praised by some and damned by others? What brought it into being? October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday. The bottom drops out of the stock market. 9 million people have their life savings wiped out. Unable to find work, Americans everywhere are filled with a growing sense of hopelessness and defeat. They're bewildered by events they cannot understand. The crisis demands leadership, but the established leaders are uncertain about what to do. When the market crashes, Herbert Hoover believes this is just a temporary dip in the business cycle, that this smash-up is due only to gambling on the stock market and the collapse of the European economy. Thinking that all that's needed is to restore confidence, the president makes reassuring speeches. He tells singer Rudy Vallee,
If you could write a song that would make people forget their troubles in this depression, I'll give you a medal.
the country suffers not just fiscal bankruptcy, but a bankruptcy of leadership as well. The president of Bethlehem Steel says,
I am afraid. Every man is afraid. I don't know, we don't know, whether the values we have are going to be real next month or not.
The president of the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad says,
I would steal before I would starve.
as the depression worsens, in the richest country in the world, between 12 and 15 million people are out of work. Critic Edmund Wilson writes,
There is not a garbage dump in Chicago which is not hunted by the hungry.
as the crisis goes on and on, more and more Americans feel the crunch. City people, country people, white and black alike. Black Americans who had not known the real prosperity of the 20s find it more and more difficult to get even the most menial jobs. And once again, no hard times. Ironically, Herbert Hoover had made a reputation as a great humanitarian by feeding millions of hungry Europeans during and after World War I. But believing in laissez-faire, the president feels that for Americans, relief is not the concern of the national government. Relief is solely the job of the cities and the states, of voluntary organizations like the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. As the Depression deepens, Hoover begins to take action, but he moves slowly and too late. An artist comments on the gloom the president radiates.
If you put a rose in Hoover's hand, it would wilt.
In the presidential election of 1932, the American people are offered the choice of a different kind of leadership. Unlike Herbert Hoover, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is a professional politician of long experience. Born to riches in an old and wealthy New York family, Franklin Roosevelt loves politics. He runs for the state senate in 1910 and is elected. He is appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy by Woodrow Wilson in 1913. Ironically, Roosevelt had admired Herbert Hoover when they had worked together in World War I under Wilson. Afterwards, Roosevelt asks Hoover to run for president on the Democratic ticket, but Hoover declines. In 1920, Roosevelt runs for vice president on a ticket with James M. Cox. They lose to Harding and Coolidge. A year later, vacationing at Campobello Island, Roosevelt suffers an attack of polio. His legs crippled, he is told his career is over. But Roosevelt is determined to learn to walk again and to re-enter the political arena. In 1924, he makes the nominating speech for Alfred E. Smith.
We offer one who has the will to win. Victory is his habit. The happy warrior, Alfred E. Smith.
Smith loses his bid for the nomination, but Roosevelt's speech solidifies his own political career. In 1928, he becomes governor of New York and takes immediate action to help the unemployed. When FDR runs for president in 1932, he calls for action.
The country needs, and unless I mistake its temper, the country demands bold, persistent experimentation. It is common sense to take a method and try it. If it fails, admit it frankly and try another. But above all, try something. The millions who are in want will not stand by silently forever, while the things to satisfy their needs are within easy reach.
In the election of 1932, Hoover carries only 6 states. The election is a Roosevelt landslide. Roosevelt can only interpret this as a massive mandate to act. But even before he can take office, the crisis worsens. In the previous 3 years, there had been more than 5,000 bank failures. Now, between election eve and Inauguration Day, in every part of the country, more and more banks close their doors. On March 4th, while the president is driving to his inauguration in Washington, the president of the New York Stock Exchange makes a brief announcement.
Trading is suspended. The stock exchange is officially closed.
Across the nation, fearing that more and more banks will close, millions wish to withdraw their savings. Within hours, every state in the Union has either closed its banks or restricted their operations. Now, with the nation's banking system in collapse, all eyes turn to Washington.
So first of all, let me assert my firm belief that the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Nameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror, which paralyzes needed effort to convert retreat into advance.
The next day, Roosevelt proclaims a bank holiday and summons Congress into special session. In an atmosphere of wartime crisis, the president asks for the immediate reopening of banks with liquid assets and power to reorganize the nation's banking system. Congress grants him the power. 3 days later, the president addresses the nation over the radio in the first of a series of memorable fireside chats. He assures the people it is now safe to entrust their money to the banks. The next morning, deposits far exceed withdrawals. The immediate crisis is over. The first 100 days of the New Deal have begun. The president had first used the phrase New Deal in his acceptance speech for the Democratic nomination. At that time, he had no specific program worked out. The New Deal comes into being as a response to events. By June 16th, the president sends 15 separate bills to Congress, and Congress passes them all. He gets laws which separate savings from commercial banking, and which for the first time guarantee federal insurance on savings deposits. He attacks unemployment, sets up direct federal relief, starts a $3.5 billion public works program. This new program gives work, gets things done, begins to restore hope. For the young unemployed, the president creates the Civilian Conservation Corps. The CCC takes 2.5 million unemployed young men off the streets and puts them to work on the conservation of our forests, on the conservation of our soil and of our water. Roosevelt attacks the farm crisis. He proposes a radical new government subsidy to farmers who agree to drastically limit farm output. He moves to slow down foreclosure of homes. The Homeowners Loan Act refinances home mortgages, and the Emergency Farm Mortgage Act refinances farm mortgages. In everything he does, the president has a double aim: recovery and reform of the economy. One of the cornerstones of the New Deal's program is the National Industrial Recovery Act. The NRA authorizes businesses to set up industry-wide codes, and for the first time sets minimum wages and maximum hours. For the first time in American history, the federal government guarantees labor the right to form trade unions. President Roosevelt surrounds himself with talented administrators, men like Harry Hopkins, Raymond Moley, General U.S. Johnson, women like Labor Secretary Frances Perkins, the first woman cabinet officer. And in 100 days, Roosevelt and his brain trust pushed through legislation to strengthen money and banking, to help agriculture, labor, and industry, and to relieve the suffering of part of the vast army of unemployed. Walter Lippmann writes,
At the end of February, we were a group of panic-stricken men. In the 100 days from March to June, we became again an organized nation, confident of our power to provide for our own security and to control our own destiny.
By 1934, the country has begun to climb out of the worst of the Depression. But the crisis is far from over. Nearly 1 out of every 4 workers is still unemployed. Many Americans are confused by all the new legislation. Others are outraged that the government pays subsidies to farmers not to grow crops, pays them to kill off their baby pigs. Conservatives feel the president has taken too much power. Others feel that Roosevelt has not done enough. Scarred by the Great Depression, millions of bewildered, hurt, and frightened people, the old, the unemployed, the disadvantaged farmers and sharecroppers, fall easy prey to extremists who promise them pie in the sky. These extremists are against the middle way of the New Deal. Dr. Francis Townsend promises millions of the aged a pension of $200 a month. The Reverend Charles Coughlin promises his followers even more, claims that his National Union of Social Justice numbers more than 9 million supporters. And Huey Long, the kingfish from Louisiana, gathers millions to his banner with a promise to soak the rich and share the wealth. He says he will make every man a king. Roosevelt begins to realize that if the followers of these demagogues unite, he faces possible defeat for re-election. His response is to demand and get still more legislation. He provides pensions for the aged, protection for the working man. He creates an even greater public works program. With $5 billion, the Works Progress Administration gives work to 3.5 million unemployed. This new WPA begins to change the face of the nation. In 1933, the Tennessee Valley Authority builds dams to harness the rampaging Tennessee River and provide electric power. The TVA is followed by more and more massive projects across the country. Bonneville Dam and Grand Coulee bring electricity for the first time to many American farms. But in 1935, the president suffers a most serious setback. The Supreme Court declares the National Recovery Act unconstitutional. The NRA is a cornerstone of the Roosevelt program. Are all the New Deal policies and legislation to be nullified and declared illegal? Roosevelt counts on an answer from the American people. In 1936, he seeks a second term. In the presidential elections, the Republicans run Governor Alf Landon of Kansas. The Union Party, the demagogues, back Congressman William Lemke of North Dakota. The American public will have a chance to vote for or against the New Deal. The mandate is unmistakable. Lemke wins less than 2% of the vote. The Republican Landon carries 2 states. Roosevelt has received the largest popular vote in the history of the presidency up until then. In the 1936 elections, many traditional Republicans moved into the New Deal camp. Blacks, who had voted Republican since the time of Lincoln, gave a huge majority to Roosevelt. They had benefited from the policies of the New Deal. A greater percentage of blacks were given the opportunity to move into government jobs, were able to become office workers. The WPA artist projects gave work to black artists and actors. But if the president has a mandate from the people for change, he still has 2 powerful opponents. In 1936, the Supreme Court again goes against him, declaring the Agricultural Adjustment Act unconstitutional. This act is another cornerstone of the New Deal. Later, it rules the New York minimum wage law unconstitutional. How can the president overcome the opposition of a conservative Supreme Court? Roosevelt takes a great political risk. He prepares a plan to to enlarge the Supreme Court, giving him the right to appoint the new justices. Congress, the press, the public are outraged. If any president can pack the Supreme Court at will, its value as guardian of our liberties would be forever lost. Congress refuses to pass the plan. But then the Supreme Court reverses itself and overturns its previous decision against minimum wages. Shortly thereafter, one of the older justices resigns. When the president appoints a new man, the balance of power changes, and the new court begins to favor New Deal policies. The second of the president's powerful opponents are union-hating employers. Big business fights against the collective bargaining guaranteed by the New Deal and refuses to sign labor contracts. Violence flares in steel mills and Detroit's auto factories. Outside Henry Ford's River Rouge plant, company guards beat up Walter Reuther of the United Automobile Workers Union. Labor retaliates with a new tactic, the sit-down strike. Workers move into factories and say they will remain until their demands are met. And workers cannot always be ousted without damage to expensive machinery. Gradually, giant industry begins to realize that these strikes are too costly. Like the Supreme Court, trade union-hating employers begin to make peace with the New Deal. In 1937, General Motors signs a contract with the auto workers, and U.S. Steel negotiates with the steel workers. The steel and automobile groups, together with the other newly organized unions, form the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, headed by John L. Lewis. The CIO makes no distinction between the skilled and the unskilled, between men and women, between black and white. Trade union membership grows from 3 million in 1933 to 9 million by 1939. As time goes on and the people become busy again, they look ahead, try to forget there ever was a depression. Soon, a new war in Europe will clear their minds of all other considerations. What then was the New Deal? The Depression was the worst collapse in American history since the Civil War. Of that enormous collapse, the head of the Farm Bureau said in 1932,
"Unless something is done for the American farmer, we will have a revolution in the countryside in less than a year."
Left-wing extremists like Earl Browder wanted a communist revolution. Father Coughlin's right-wing extremists wanted a fascist revolution. But Roosevelt and the New Deal were not revolutionary. Though it marked a profound change in our American style of government. Though some said it went too far, and others said it didn't go far enough, the New Deal was in truth the middle way.
We were against revolution, therefore we waged war against those conditions which make revolutions. In America in 1933, the people did not attempt to remedy wrongs by overthrowing their institutions. Americans were made to realize that wrongs could and would be set right within their institutions. We proved that democracy can work.